Hi handsome and welcome to my 41st video. It's been a while since we saw each other and even longer since we talked about a contentious topic, so I thought that it would be a great idea to start a new year by doing something bigger and maybe even ruffling some feathers. So let's talk about the open world PvP in BDO and all of its issues. This video has been a long time coming. I have been thinking about making something like this for some time, but if there was one incident that I would call the straw that broke the camel's back, it would for sure be the choice in Divio's document and subsequent flight to the NA Pearlbase HQ. Before we get going, I would like to mention that this video is here to mostly spark discussion. I will be talking and going against the narrative that has been spread by the PvP community about BDO, as well as even debunking some of the misconceptions spread by them. But at the end of the day, this is still just my opinion, so please be mindful of this in the comments. Videos like this are usually made by people on either side of the fence, but mostly by people for whom open world PvP is their primary means of enjoyment in the game and therefore show a lot of bias. I am not one of these people, so I hope that this video manages to bring another perspective on this topic, because the issue really isn't black and white. I would also like to make it fully clear that I am not against open world PvP as a concept in and of itself. I just don't believe that BDO can execute on that concept well, for the reasons that I will outline during the video that stem from flaws both on the side of the game and the community. I do understand that it's hard to not come out as overly negative on the idea as a whole, especially considering the structure that this video will be taking, but I do hope that we can come out of this more understanding of the role the open world PvP plays in the game that we allegedly all love. During the video, I will be looking at open world PvP from multiple angles. I will be outlining the main issues that this form of gameplay has, as well as all suggestions, or at least the most popular ones, that have been made by the community, why they most likely wouldn't work to fix the issues outlined, and the changes that would actually have to happen where open world PvP return to once again being something people look forward to. I am not presenting these solutions as the only possible ones, but these are the steps, however improbable they might be, that the game would have to take in order to make open world PvP more appealing to more than just the people who it already appeals to. Now, although I'm sure that most of you know what I'm talking about, it's a good idea to define our terms. Open world PvP refers to player versus player combat and encounters that are not opt-in and can happen at any time and almost any point in the world. In essence, while other forms of PvP are more controlled by the game, be it through the numbers of players that can join, the gear and the level requirement and limits, or even the skill of the players themselves, open world PvP has almost none of these things. With that somewhat long description out of the way, we can start with the dissection of open world PvP in BDO. Now, I wasn't really sure where to start. I think it would be nice to continue with semantics, because there is one thing I believe I need to address before we can talk about anything else, since I am almost certain that these comments would have appeared otherwise. I am of course talking about the idea that BDO is, or at least was, a PvP game, or even better, that it has been advertised as such. Let's take these one at a time. Now, looking at that sentence itself, we already have an issue, because not only is BDO already classified as an MMORPG, there really is no such thing as a quote-unquote PvP game. Googling PvP games gets you results ranging from Counter-Strike and League of Legends to Elden Ring and Path of Exile. Similarly, there is no definition of what a PvP game should entail, and it's not even specific to a single genre. The only thing we can surmise from the list that is given to us is that a PvP game simply stands for a game with at least one PvP mode, which would prove the people saying that BDO is a PvP game correct, but I do have a feeling that this is not actually what they mean when they say it. What I think that these players mean when they say BDO is a PvP game is that it is a PvP game rather than a PvE game. Now, here's the funny thing. Using the same method of googling PvE games, every single MMO that appeared in the PvP search also appeared here. Yes, That includes Albion Online and Throne and Liberty. Obviously, there were games that did not appear under the PvE search, which indicates that those games are the true PvP games. Using these games, we can come up with a set of rules that these games would have to follow in order to be considered PvP games. 1. The game requires other players in order to be playable. 2. The PvP is the only or the main game mode in the game offered. 3. The player must engage with the PvP systems in order to progress in the game. Progression can take many forms, such as gear and getting upgrades, or getting cosmetics, or even just climbing in a ranked mode. 4. If the game has you fighting AI, these are bots replicating human behavior and acting as players, not special enemies with their own movesets, and you still have to kill them like you would a regular player. 5. PvP is accessible to the player immediately or right after completing the tutorial. And 6. Finally, the PvP has an end goal, usually either beating the opponent or reaching a certain amount of points, upon reaching which the match resets and all players start from zero. Now, this rule set isn't perfect. There are probably games that don't fit one or two of these criteria that most people would probably say are PvP games. I would say that you can probably have a game that doesn't fit one or two of these 6 criteria and you could still argue that it is a PvP game. Personally, I think that a PvP game should denote a game that is PvP only, where PvP is the primary and often the only type of gameplay, not a game which simply has PvP as an option. If we look at these 6 rules and put them into BDO, we can say that it arguably only fits the very first. And even then, you can play MMOs with 0 players in them and enjoy most of the content as long as the servers are running. You can't queue up into Summoner's Rift or Dust 2 with nobody else playing. Similarly, no matter which map or game mode in Valorant you play, you're always doing PvP, and the only way to unlock new characters or to climb in rank is to do PvP or to take your credit card. Conversely, in BDO, PvP not only isn't the main game mode, it is so optional to the point where you can completely ignore it and never engage with it in any way and progress in the game to complete hard cap. In fact, you need to do PvE in order to be able to do PvP in the first place, which also means that it will take you tens if not hundreds of hours to even quote-unquote unlock PvP in BDO, depending on the PvP mode of your choice. Alright, so now that we know that BDO is not a PvP game, let's discuss the idea that it was sold to people as such, or that it was PvP game once before. Because I honestly have absolutely zero clue whatsoever where people got this idea from. For starters, let's look at the Steam store page for BDO. This is what it looks like. On the right side, you can see a couple of words that probably say about the game. They say what type of game it is, that being an open world action MMORPG, and then they list out some of the features and things you can do as a player. The first thing the game advertises is the combat itself, then the PvE bosses, Siege, and finally professions. So we have one mention of Siege, which the game doesn't even specify is PvP content, alongside a plethora of PvE and life skill content. This doesn't really scream PvP game to me. Scrolling down into the About Game section, we see basically the same text as before, followed by showing clips of the game world, character customization, combat where a ninja is fighting a group of basilisks, and only then do we get our first and only mention of PvP on the entire page, which is Node Wars and Siege. The page then also shows the remastered mode, graphics, and life skills. If I was looking at this page from a new player's point of view, I would not think, oh yeah, this game is all about PvP. Compare this to a game like Dead by Daylight, where you immediately know that it is an asymmetrical PvP game, or Marvel Rivals, I cannot say that, Marvel Rivals, that tell you that the game is a PvP shooter in the very first sentence. But Luneye, I hear you say, BDO wasn't always on Steam. And you are correct. Here is what the game says about itself on its own page. If we click on overview, we see 3 different chapters. The first one says basically the same thing as the blurb on Steam did. Then you get the story of the game in large detail, and finally it tells you the features, which include the graphics, the combat, node war and siege, life skills, character customization, and knowledge. Yes, knowledge is a feature advertised by the game on the same level as large-scale PvP. And to those of you who say that this is what the game says now, but it was different back then, sadly, I cannot find what the page looked like in like 2015, 2016, as the Wayback Machine only takes me back to 2021, but in 2021, the page was basically the same as it is now, and the fact that the last expansion mentioned here is Mountain of Eternal Winter kinda tells me that it probably isn't getting changed very often, if at all. So that is what the game says about itself. What does it show to the player? We got trailers too. Let's start with the ones on Steam. We have 2 Dead trailers, then we have a trailer showcasing world bosses and whatever this is, I have no idea. So yeah, there is no PvP here. The only thing that you can attribute to PvP are these screenshots, one of which I assume is from AOS or maybe Battle Arena or something like that, and the other from what looks like Node Wars. But I am sure that this is not enough for the people determined that BDO was sold as a PvP game first and foremost. So let's have a look at some other trailers. Here is the launch trailer for the game released by Gamespot 8 years ago. I will be editing it down a little bit, but you can watch them yourselves if you think that I am purposefully hiding the PvP from you. In essence, we have a 2-minute trailer where the first minute is just moving the camera through some landscape, a brief look at combat of a Valkyrie and a Zerker fighting some imps and I think giants respectively, then parts of a cutscene from the story, some NPCs, some mobs, Xarka the world boss, then some more fighting mobs, and roughly 3 seconds of someone shooting a cannon and a musket in what looks like a siege and a node war. Yeah, not much PvP here either. Still not convinced that BDO was not sold as a PvP game? How about the first ever 2 trailers that were ever released by Pearl Abyss themselves 12 years ago? These 2 have basically the same structure of landscape shots, killing of mobs, showing of character models on NPCs, some more killing mobs, finished with what looked like the siege on Heidel Castle of all things. The second trailer does have more PvP to show, but that is only because it is more footage from the same siege. And even then, it looks like the characters are killing the NPC defenders or attackers rather than each other, giving the game more of a Dynasty Warriors type of look than anything else. Ironically enough, the only official PvP trailer for the game itself that I have been able to find comes from the year, and you should really sit down for this, okay? 2024. Yeah, one look at the comments says more than I ever could in this section. That's not all though, guys. We also have some game reviews from the time, since these are also a form of marketing of your product. I choose the IGN and the Gamespot ones, since these are probably the largest gaming media that you can find. I would love you to guess what the IGN review starts with. Quote, I've spent the last few hours in Black Desert Online, not plunking arrows into orcs or testing my skills against other players, but in attempting to tame horses. Yeah, for those of you who somehow guessed that he would start by talking about taming horses, I have no idea how you managed to do it, but congratulations. The author then goes to talk about the world and how realistic it feels, talks about the depth of the various life skills, especially farming, and then talks about the story system and the endgame, or lack thereof. As a side note, I did find it very interesting that he sees the lack of endgame as a good thing because it does allow him to take in the sights in the game. 2016 truly was a different time for gaming, wasn't it? He then talks about the classes, gender locking, the cosmetics and cash shop, the grind, the story and quest design, is skeptical about the longevity of the game because there are no raids or dungeons, and the only other mention of PvP is that the sieges are still coming and that whatever PvP there is all about having better gear than your opponent. As for the Gamespot review, it starts by dunking on the UI and the core new player experience, as well as the localization. The writer then talks about the world and the life skills and how the game feels realistic, much like his IGN counterpart. Then we get an entire paragraph about fishing, one about farming and the worker system, then the storage system, followed by complaining about the game being unnecessarily difficult to understand, talk about gathering and the energy system, where he also mentions the cash shop, and with 4 paragraphs left to go, the first one describes the graphics, the second mentions the enemy NPCs, the third the combat itself, and finally the lack of quality of life in the game itself. That's right, in reviewing this PvP game, the writer only mentions PvP in passing in the second to last sentence, where he mentions the only PvP content we have talked about so far, Siege. So, somehow, this game that allegedly got marketed as a PvP game, or even better, an open world PvP one, doesn't feature PvP on its Steam page almost at all. Its original trailers show more cooperative gameplay, where people fight monsters together, and only feature the Siege Wars, and the game didn't even release with the only PvP content shown in its advertising in the West in the first place. Naturally, you might wonder what the Korean folk said about the game. Sadly, I didn't manage to find any reviews from the time, but I did find an interview on Inven from 2015 with these Pearlbis employees whose names I am too afraid to pronounce, that talk about the new region, Valencia. Obviously don't speak Korean, so this was translated to me by Google, but it is still pretty cool that it even exists. For the purpose of the video, this is the extent of their talk about PvP across the entire interview. These are the only 2 questions out of the total of 27 that were asked. One asking about more castles to Siege, and another about the endgame PvP and PvE content for the game, with the rest focusing on many different aspects of the game such as PvE, life skills, new class, etc. So the question remains, where and when did BDO become a PvP game in the eyes of the people who say that it is? I think I just answered my own question, didn't I? The people who play this game for its PvP and everything else as just the gateway to PvP are most likely the same people who now say that BDO is a PvP game. Needless to say, shifting an entire game's genre simply because what you enjoy or because you cannot comprehend that other people play the game for other reasons than to just PvP is exactly the reason why we are in the situation that we are in right now when it comes to talking about BDO's content, where every PvE zone is denigrated to just being running in circles, where boss blitz content is boring because you only do it once or a couple of times and then you solved it, and life skills are just a way for PvPers to get their consumables, or maybe an AFK activity to do while you sleep. Really, the battle of PvE and PvP enjoyers precedes BDO by many years. People have, however, over the years cultivated the sense of superiority for enjoying PvP. I also think that the content creators played a role in popularizing PvP, since it would be hard for me to deny how popular the PvP content from even back in the day was. To me, this is not surprising, since PvP is more exciting to watch than PvE, as it usually is something to either aspire to and something you can learn from, or something you just want to see for the spectacle and usually something that you cannot or do not want to do yourself. Really, the only type of PvE content that is arguably as popular as PvP is raiding and challenge runs in certain games, such as the hardcore server in World of Warcraft, or Iron Man in OSRS, and even to a lesser extent BDO today. Nobody really wants to watch you just chopping trees or killing orcs for the 20th time in a row, and it is also harder to make funny videos or even just videos in general on such content. Still, this is not the game advertising itself, since using the logic of game is what the content creators make it, World of Warcraft today would most likely constitute a roguelike. Now, there is a way to interpret this as a fault of the game, because looking at the last statement I just made, you will quickly realize that BDO had neither the raids and endgame dungeons content of World of Warcraft, nor did it have the challenge run format of OSRS. BDO then became a PvP game through the process of elimination, where the endgame became PvP. This is sadly a trap that a lot of sandbox MMOs fall into, that is that despite how much content the game offers, people will inevitably focus on one or two aspects of it and only do that. That being said, to then call a sandbox MMO a PvP game is to also ignore everything else the sandbox has to offer you. And while I understand why people would choose to ignore chunks of the content for themselves and only focus on the things that they liked, I cannot understand why the same people would then make others adhere to their preferences and definitions. Alright, now that we have hopefully shown that BDO is not and never really has been a PvP game, and it is just a game with some PvP modes included in it, we can continue with the main topic of the video. It is time to finally talk about the flaws of the open world PvP. Let's start with the most obvious one and the largest issue that causes most of the other problems that we will be talking about. The fact that open world PvP is uncapped with no restriction on gear, which leads to what we call gear checking, where the difference between the gear of the two players fighting is substantial enough to be either a large advantage for the better guild player, or in most cases, make it absolutely impossible for the person with the worst gear to compete in the first place. I'm not talking just about gear score, as you also need PvP specific stats such as evasion and accuracy, which means that a player often requires at least 2 sets of gear on them ready to go at any given time, one for PvE and the other for PvP. This is, in my opinion, the largest contributing factor as to why the open world PvP is as dead as it is. When a player knows that they have no chance of winning, they will not bother fighting, which leaves the other player without an opponent, meaning that no PvP can happen. The problem of gear checking actually works both ways. If a player dies simply because they are the worst player, it is very easy to think that they died because the other guy just had better gear, finding a scapegoat instead of actually improving. This just makes them less willing to learn how to PvP, and while the other scapegoat of his class is just broken would still exist even if gear checking didn't, something way more common in capped content such as AOS, the gear is usually the first thing that comes to mind in the open world environment. Regardless of the source, the end result is the same, and to this day, if you go out to fight someone, you will only fight them maybe a handful of times before one side realizes that they have no chance and leave. Another issue stemming from gear checking is that it creates a sort of totem pole effect. People with the highest gear will sit at the top and push the people contesting them downwards, who will then go to lower end areas and thus place the people with worse gear than them, and so forth and so on, all the way to the very bottom of the pole, where the people buried so low can never have a chance to climb up until everyone above them moves to a better zone. The catchier name for this is gatekeeping. People with worse gear are gatekept from entering the better areas by people above them, even if they could grind efficiently at that spot had those players not been there. This then makes the problem of gear checking even worse, since you are most of the time going to be fighting someone either above you in gear or below you in gear, making most fights basically predetermined. The knee-jerk reaction of the PvP player base usually then is that the sheer option for the other player to leave is a bad thing, and that additions such as the Marnie realm or the shorter server swap cooldowns are to blame. But the only difference the removal of these systems would make would be that the losing player would just leave the game entirely instead. Forcing people to do something they don't want to do only so the other side has some fun is a surefire way to kill your game on the spot. Imagine playing League of Legends where all you have in your inventory is a pair of boots while the enemy team is full build, or playing Counter-Strike where all you have is a knife and the enemy team has AKs and you are told that you cannot surrender. There are only a couple of genres and games that feature unbalanced open world PvP, and most of these are extraction shooters, such as Escape from Tarkov or Hunt Showdown, or survival games like Rust. These games have actually found 3 ways to combat the gear checking issue though. The first 2 sadly are not applicable to MMOs. These are server wipes, meaning that every couple of months your progression gets completely removed and you start from zero. This is obviously antithetical to MMOs. The second one is that these games are almost always first-person shooters, so a sufficiently skilled player can kill another regardless of their gear, usually with a well-placed headshot or by catching them off guard with a good strategic play. Again, MMOs are not shooters, so we are stuck with a system based on an old RPG mechanic of numbers deciding everything. However, the last way that these games combat the problem of gear checking is something that we can actually see some other MMOs adopt in their open world PvP. You lose gear on death. Even better, the players who killed you can take it from you. This creates an inherent risk versus reward dynamic where the better, more expensive gear will get you an advantage, but if you encounter a better player or are simply ganked by a group of them, you risk losing it for good. Examples of MMOs successfully using this method are OSRS, Albion Online, and EVE Online. However, this is yet another thing that doesn't really work for BDO. Losing gear on death is simply something that cannot work with the intense grind that the game requires of you. The natural solution to this issue, and the second possible fix to the gear checking problem found in BDO, is to actually make the grind less severe. Make it easier to obtain gear, provide more catch-up mechanics, and so on. This would make the problem go away somewhat, at least to the point where people would be more willing to try and stay and fight. But guess what? A large portion of the open world PvP player base really dislikes this idea. According to some people in the community, giving out handouts and making the progression through the game faster is what is killing the game. Some people would love the new players to still grind Sosans, and when some of the gear devalues, such as when the Deboreka accessories were falling in price, people complain and make videos that their gear is losing value, and then they grind it for nothing, and some of them even quit the game in boycott. Now I'll be honest, this line of thinking makes absolutely zero sense to me. Catch-up mechanics are crucial in any long-running game. Imagine if in order to raid in FF14 or in World of Warcraft, you would have to clear every single previous raid while item level synced. This line of thinking is also very selfish. It is all about, my gear has no value and I grind it for nothing, without looking at the 10 years worth of content any would-be new player would have to crawl through. The only mistake a new player would make in such a scenario is starting the game later than you, and I don't know why they should be punished for that. This kind of logic is also pretty inconsistent with itself. People pretend like the Pen Black Star was the first time the game has given out handouts, and they will then point to the decline in the concurrent player base on Steam as some sort of evidence that they are correct in thinking this way. Well, here are some other catch-ups that have been put into the game and had no impact on the player base whatsoever. Season servers in 2020, Retina accessories in 2021, Valencia Gamespot updates in 2021, as well as every single subsequent Silvers update that we have had since, Retina's guaranteed pen boss gear, as well as the Magnus quest line rewards in 2022, free Capocia accessories and Teddy Black Star in 2023. Really, it's like every single year they introduce more and more catch-up mechanics, and every single year the same crowd gets their panties in a twist and starts yelling about the game becoming too easy and that the new players are progressing too fast and how it's killing the game because the fastest way is to not play the game. Needless to say, had gear been more accessible, people would be willing to PvP more often because they would feel like they have more of a chance to actually win. Something that we can very clearly see in BDO itself, because AOS is much more popular than RBF, and Tier 1, Tier 2 Node Wars are also much more popular than their higher tiers counterparts. You can't keep telling people that uncapped PvP is where it's at, while simultaneously sitting on your piles of billions of silver worth of gear and not sharing it with anyone. The only PvP that happens in such a situation is your personal power fantasy, and I don't need to tell you that nobody really cares enough to be your personal target dummy just so you feel better about the time you spent in a video game. The argument I can already hear against the idea of capped open world PvP goes something like this. Luneye, if there is capped PvP, why would anyone get gear? What is the reason to progress in this game? To which I have two things to say. First, the introduction of capped open world PvP doesn't mean that uncapped will go away, it simply means that players now have a way to enjoy open world PvP that doesn't involve thousands of hours of grind just to get there, and ultimately they have more of a choice of what kind of PvP they want to have, and I think that having a choice is always a good thing. The second is even more simple. Endgame PvE content. It already exists in some capacity and it seems to be only getting more and more profound. The group boss blitz as well as the Calamity 8 through 9 single player version both require a lot of gear from you. Endgame Gamespot also aren't easy to get gear for, and if we do end up getting the 100th floor dungeon they teased in Heidelberg this year, that is yet another huge drive for players to get gear. All of what we have talked about so far is without even mentioning the effect gear checking has on the pay to win in the game. Large part as to why BDO feels less pay to win nowadays is because the open world PvP and PvP that is uncapped in general is less prevalent. So fewer people feel as if they are being forced to spend money on the game, which leads me to yet another misconception that the people who enjoy PvP would have you believe. Some people in the PvP community will have you believe that they are the reason why BDO is still in business, that they are the ones spending the most on the game. I have not been able to find a single source that would support these claims. Really, the only connection I can find is in the pay to win I just mentioned, where you will find videos of BDO whales from back in the day spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on the game just to stay ahead of the curve. I don't really see how making the game more pay to win is helping it in any way, and at the same time, whales can exist even without pay to win. Just look at League of Legends and the faker Ahri skin. At the same time, the PvP community will do its absolute best to tell you that the game is dead, dog shit, not worth playing, and that if you do play it, you should not spend any money on it and have to be effectively boycotting the game to make the game better somehow. Looking at the larger MMO and even video game market as a whole, you can quite easily see that it is indeed the casual player base who makes the most money for these companies, evidenced in the near constant outcries of X game making things easier and quote-unquote casualized to attract a larger player base. I probably don't have to even dedicate this much time to point out that more players in the game means more money for the company, but for some reason I have the feeling that someone would inevitably raise the idea that PvPers have made sure we have a game to play or something along those lines in the comments if I didn't point it out here. To go even further from my original point that I was making, we have a tangent within a tangent, and that is the monetization of BDO in and of itself, since I know that a lot of people have an issue with it. Here is the thing, this monetization system truly is the only way to sustain an MMO, as we can see evidenced in every other MMO implementing some sort of microtransactions into their monetization systems. Some people say that they would much rather pay a subscription instead of such a cash shop. Well, to put things into perspective, I went to check Pearl Abyss's own financial records that we can get thanks to the company being publicly traded. See how much money they spend in a year. Using today's conversion rate, their last 4 quarters come up to a little bit over $240 million in operating expenses, which means the amount of money that the company spends every year, give or take, just to keep running. So these are salaries, commissions, bills, etc. If we assume a subscription price of $15 a month, a single player would get them $180 in a given year. So in order to just break even without making a single cent of profit for the company, the game would need a total of at least 1.3 million active subscribers a year. I think that we can now put this discussion to rest. Let's continue with talking about the next issue. Open world PvP is inherently cannibalistic in nature. Now, this is still slightly connected with the gear checking issue, but even with that solved, this would still persist due to the skill disparity between players and the simple fact that some people don't want to PvP in the first place. So, say you kill a person who doesn't want to fight back. He might just sigh and go to a different server or to a different spot. Say someone else kills him there again and again and again, to the point where the guy decides that enough is enough, and since he isn't having any fun, he uninstalls the game. Ha ha ha, get good scrap, you say to him, not realizing that you just lost someone who you might have been potentially PvPing in the future. Make this happen enough times, and you get to the point where we are now, where people don't want to fight at all because they feel like they get no chance to win and most likely don't want to PvP in the first place. The problem here really is a symptom of open world PvP not being consensual. A person seeking out PvP is probably much less likely to quit after getting defeated than someone who's just minding their business and gets repeatedly murdered. There simply needs to exist a punitive system for just randomly killing people in the open world, otherwise you turn this game into a Wild West. Like we talked briefly in the first issue, nobody wants to play a game where all they do is be your content. But let's take it a step further. Open world PvP has been the biggest deterrent for new players, even to this day. If you are one of the people who take pleasures in making sure that others are not having fun, especially if those other people cannot fight back, then you have most likely met some of them quit. Let's say that you do that with 10 players a year. Now let's say that there are another 5,000 people like you in a given year who do the same thing. Congratulations! Your group just cost the game 50,000 players and 50,000 potential paying customers. Really? You cannot be surprised that the game chose the majority player base over the much smaller open world PvP one. At the end of the day, it's just business. There is also the issue as to why the one-sided guild decks got removed in the first place, which I have already mentioned but we will talk about briefly. And yes, you guessed it, it's because the PvP community was using it to harass other players, and especially streamers that came over from Lost Ark. Some of you couldn't behave, so now the entire class has to stay in detention for the time being. And of course, in response to the changes at the time, the same group of people decided that their best course of action that would have definitely gotten everyone on their side was to go and harass and grief players even more in protest. Great job proving Perlab is correct, guys. I absolutely also must point out this guy on the forums saying that it was the streamer's fault for getting griefed and that the streamers should take personal accountability in how they react to getting stream sniped. Like, how do you write something along these lines and completely miss the point that you are the problem? And to then end the entire comment by saying that PA gave the whining players everything and it ruined the balance of the game is just irony on top of irony. Now, here is another nice thought experiment, including numbers. We should talk about the player counts, because this is yet another thing that the PvP community clings onto for dear life. Saying, look at the game now, it removed PvP and now it's dead, now it's not worth playing. Well, first of all, we don't know why the player count dipped this summer, which led to this exact problem that I alluded to already, where people just take anything that loosely correlates with the drops in numbers and make it their main cause. Depending on who you ask, the drop in numbers is because of the handouts, the removal of one-sided guild decks, the karma changes, the node war changes, lack of raids and dungeons, devs not listening, bad gameplay balance, pay to win, cronstones, the enhancing system, Luneye's videos, Jay buying a new hamster. Honestly, you can make up anything you want and then point to the numbers and say, see, I told you so. Now, you don't need me to tell you that correlation does not mean causation, and there really isn't one singular reason why the game has suffered the drop. That being said, I do definitely subscribe to the idea that node war changes were at least a large contributor to the player exodus, which is a discussion for another day, but we can all agree on the fact that the node wars were mismanaged, to put it very lightly. The one-sided guild decks, on the other hand, got removed in August of 2023 and were followed by a larger number of concurrent players than the year prior. So I do think that it has very little, if not nothing, to do with that change. Moving on to more problems, we have the issue of the reward structure that the open world PvP has. The way that it is rewarded according to the player base is by fighting over resources. So in essence, if two people want to grind at a spot, but there is only one rotation, one of these players will not be able to grind there, so they end up fighting over the spot with one victor. This is a neat idea in theory, but it has a very long cascading effect that can really only be felt the longer the game goes on. By prolonging this fight over resources, you inevitably create the haves and the have-nots. Since these resources are the way to get better gear, the people who win these initial fights will have the resources the other people either can't get at all or can't get as fast for any subsequent fight, and therefore will have an advantage from that time onwards. Now, if you copy the situation over the span of, let's say, 8 to 10 years, you end up with a system where the haves are completely untouchable by the have-nots and can hoard all the resources to themselves, completely removing any and all would-be future fighting over these resources. Now, believe it or not, this is not even the only problem with the reward structure of open world PvP. The other problem is the circular structure that it even has, where you need to do PvP in order to do PvE so that you can do more PvP over more PvE. This means that if you only want to do one of these activities, give or take half of your playtime will be spent doing something you do not want to do. These two playstyles are almost antithetical to each other, and as such, attract a much smaller player base when put together than a full PvP or a full-on PvE game would do. And such, a player base is made even smaller with the addition of MMORPG mechanics and long-term progression systems that removes fair and even fights. The other side of this coin is that it creates further friction between players, which might be a good or a bad thing depending on your outlook. You already have people saying that Arsha is a PvE server because it gives you drop rate that you only use in PvE, which would only get worse were Arsha to ever receive an increase to these PvE buffs. Now, I will be truly honest, I don't think there really is a way to fix this issue. Moving the reward structure from PvE to PvP only opens the game up for exploits. The scrapped sheriffs or bounty system from back in the day is a prime example that sounds nice on paper until you realize that the sheriff would go to help you only to collect their bounty, and it would therefore be in their best interest to let the other guy farm you repeatedly so that he gets the largest possible reward that he can, assuming that they are not coordinating with the guy farming your ass in the first place. The community would have you believe that the fix is to just amp up the rewards, but I don't think this actually makes anyone willing to PvP if the problem is that they cannot PvP. Other MMOs fix this by rewarding PvP with PvP specific gear that cannot be used outside of that context, but this is notably within instanced PvP, such as battlegrounds and arenas, so I don't think that this would really work in an open world context. The best solution for this issue probably was the Arsha event we had a while back, but since that is an event, we cannot expect it to be a constant and a somewhat rigid reward structure, and even within that event, we had people abusing the system by grouping up, and here we have yet another set of issues. So join me on my final tangent, because we need to talk about... We see this phenomenon across all PvP games. MMOs take this idea into a completely different level, where instead of having an advantage, the entire MMO becomes a zero-sum game. This is best seen in what was supposed to be the BDO killer number, like 7 at this point? Yeah, Throne and Liberty. And yes, I'm talking about the mega alliances in that game. Instead of several guilds fighting for resources like everyone likes so much, the system devolved into megalith guilds hoarding everything, while the smaller guild either joined them or disbanded. And the worst part about this is that there is basically nothing the developer can do outside of just removing the alliance system outright. In BDO, we saw this with the warlord guilds, most notorious of which was Show Nation. A guild which ran nearly every other guild out of the server, made the survivor guilds drop into lower tier node wars and then follow them there, killing the entire node war scene then and there, only to then publicly boast about quote-unquote running the server and blame the game because they're bored now. As we have already seen many times, the reaction of the PvP community was largely that this is the bad thing, that the dictator of their server dying is something to mourn. What should have been a race to the top following the announcement turned into a why bother, and PvP is dead now. Once again, completely missing the point that these are the people who are to blame for PvP dying, that they were the reason why nobody wanted to PvP in the large scale, that their want of winning made everyone else quit. One of the alleged founding members of Cho even commented on the Reddit post by stating exactly what I have just said, and the top reply is, I love the drama and tension open world PvP provides. As if this is some Viking saga to be told, and not a live service game that requires thousands of players to operate. How you can paint a guild making others disband as Pearl Abyss's fault truly is beyond my comprehension. And what is more is now that they want Pearl Abyss to bring these GVGs back. I don't even know that we should ask why, I think that we should be asking how. Which brings me back to the idea of rewarding open world PvP and the path of least resistance. Simply put, you cannot reward PvP in the same way as you can PvE. It will never work because people will simply abuse these systems. Make RBF and AOS competitive with their PvE counterparts, people will be AFKing or do the least required action to get their rewards. Bring back the scrap bounty system. We already mentioned how it would be better for a sheriff to let you get farmed than stopping it early. Make a spot or two that make more money than any other spot by far. People will get their friends, guildies or even viewers to guard them while they grind. Reward the killing of other players themselves. People will go to low level spots to farm newbies. For every single possible way of rewarding PvP, there are equally as many ways people will exploit the system in order to get their money as fast as possible. Next up, we need to address something that doesn't have to do much with the open world PvP itself, but is getting talked about a lot within that context. The idea that open world PvP is good because it is player interaction. Here, the problem lies more with the design of the game as a whole, and it has to do with the lack of positive player interaction. Open world PvP, for most people, is considered to be negative player interaction. All you need to do is tell me what is the first thing you think of when you are grinding and you see another white dot appear on the minimap. I'm willing to bet that for most of you, it's either something like, oh shit, am I gonna get killed and lose my spot? Or, oh shit, is this guy going to grind in my spot? Or something along those lines. When all your player interaction is negative, you will eventually stop seeking them out. To be fair, this was less of an issue back in the day, when people did want to fight each other. When, if your homie got jumped, you immediately got on your tier 5 horse and ran as fast as you could along with half of your guild to save them. However, because of the many issues already pointed out, alongside the ever-present efficiency mindset, most MMO gamers today see no reason to GVG because it makes them no money. These have largely phased out. We don't live in 2018 anymore, so now there is no GVG to be had, and while you can blame the game for this, I do honestly believe that the brunt of the blame of the lack of GVGs falls on the players. You could bring one-sided decks back tomorrow, and I can guarantee you that these random GVGs in the middle of nowhere that you so distinctly remember from back in the day would not happen. And even if they somehow did, they would be much smaller in scale and over much sooner. Which really brings me to my next point. Do you really want open world PvP? Because if you do, the best way to get it is not by complaining on Reddit or the forums or even making videos that the game has lost its direction. The best way to get open world PvP back is by logging into the game and doing it yourself. This here is probably the largest problem with PvP in general. You need other players. By not doing PvP yourself, you are making sure that other people have less people to play against, therefore eventually they stop doing it, removing even more people from PvP, and it creates a vicious cycle. Yes, Pearl Abyss could maybe help things by forcing PvP on everyone, but we already talked about why this is a very short-term strategy. No. What needs to happen is that you need to take matters into your own hands. And I'm not saying that you should go and alt-C on the farmers in Velia Cliff, or to go and sink people fishing at Hakoven Island. I mean, go and organize your PvP fights. If you are a content creator watching this by any chance, make community events. I'm sure your viewers would love it. If you're a guild leader, try talking with other guilds and organizing GVGs yourselves, because the system still exists, it just needs to be consensual. If you're just an average Joe, try to see if there are people around your gear score specific zones and try to fight them on Arsha. Try going to Battle Arena and see if you can improve there. Try AOS and make PvP friends there. Join a PvP guild or a PvP Discord and see what change you can make on a personal level instead of just waiting for Perlebis to make a move. The largest contributing reason as to why open world PvP looks the way it does is simply because people do not want to do it. But the answer isn't in forced conscription into PvP zones or by making everyone your bitch. The answer lies in making people want to PvP in a fair and exciting manner. Really, the question I was asking myself the entire time I was writing this was the question of why don't open world PvPers like the idea of capped content? And why do some of them not like Arsha servers either? I have seen ideas on Reddit and other sites thrown around, proposing changes such as gear caps for specific zones and a bunch of other similar ideas with the purpose of making PvP more fair and balanced activity. And every single time I saw them, the same open world PvP crowd said that the person proposing these ideas is stupid, they don't know what they are talking about, and that capped content is terrible and there is no reason to get gear if there exists one, and really the best way to increase open world PvP in the game is by removing karma or bringing one-sided decks back. All of this led me to the idea that open world PvPers, or at least a sizable portion of them, don't really want to PvP, they just want to dominate. They don't want any of the risk, but all of the rewards. Looking at the problems that we have talked about so far through this lens, why would you want to give new players gear when that means that they might actually stand a chance fighting you? Why give them even a chance to fight back in the form of capped PvP, because that means that your gear doesn't matter and therefore it's an even playing field that you might actually lose. Why protect them from corpse camping and other forms of griefing when that is just a part of the game, and if you don't like it, you should just make a level 49 character or just leave the game. But God forbid that someone goes to my spot and grinds over me, because then they are just a griefer and they are making my game worse and I can't do anything, and if I swap servers, I am just letting the griefer win. Instead of making changes that would unironically benefit the PvP scene overall, because more people would simply be willing to try to PvP. These PvP, I don't really know what to call them, but elitists propose frankly stupid changes that do nothing for the scene and only benefit them specifically. A perfect example of this is from the Choice and Devious document, where they propose that Arsha gives them more trash loot, that it gives them the trash even if they are not killing monsters, and that it makes more money than anywhere else. Like I said before, this is not fixing open world PvP. This is not making anyone want to do open world PvP. This is just making the entire problem of dividing the player base into the haves and the have-nots million times worse. This is put on display in the Choice and Devious document, where they only talk about open world PvP from the position of I should be rewarded for defending my spot, but completely ignore the other side of the people who would have lost theirs and they would now feel frustrated and end up leaving the game. The reaction from these people often is that these people leaving is a good thing and that they needed to get good, or they just got filtered, either blissfully ignorant or purposefully disregarding the fact that such behavior is why the game has never been as large as it really deserves to be, and in fact has been stagnant and slowly dying long before the 2024 Hideout Ball. This brings me to the question I posed in the title of this video. Honestly, I think that it is, but not in the way that the endgame gear lords would probably want. In order to truly save it, to make open world PvP a part of the game that people want to enjoy and not just a nuisance that they have to deal with every now and then, we would have to take steps that I honestly don't believe the open world PvP community is willing to take. Introducing capped open world PvP is really the big one, second only to making open world PvP a truly consensual experience. We already have the latter in the form of the Arsha servers, and by capped I mean truly capped, none of this seasonal Arsha bullshit. Whether this is by expanding the idea that the Choice plus Devious document had and use AOS level gear, or in a similar manner to the hardcore server, which we yet have to see play out, doesn't really matter to me in the large scope. The point is that there needs to be a way for the players to be able to engage with the PvP on their own level throughout the game and not just once they reach 780 gear score. Originally, the title of this video was that you cannot fix open world PvP, and I believe that this is largely true, as long as your goal is to make open world PvP into a way to progress your character, rather than just a fun activity that you can do on the side. PvP in MMOs rarely dies because the developer fucks up. It almost always is because the community takes the path of least resistance and slowly metagames the fun out of the game. The only solution proposed by the same people who do this is to then introduce systems that are only fun for them and nobody else, making the PvP scene shrink more and more by gatekeeping new players and even having negative effects on the overall player base as they turn to the people who are not willing to participate in PvP at all once their well of PvPers runs dry. By getting to this conclusion, I think that we have gone full circle and are returning to the very first topic we talked about. PvP in general needs to be rewarded on par with the other systems according to the PvPers, because these people believe that BDO is a PvP game. Of course that if you believe that, it feels disappointing that you cannot do PvP or that it is not as rewarding as the other content. And since we already talked about why this is a false premise that was probably spread by the same people who are spreading it around to this day, that the discussion can end here. We wouldn't want to be arguing in circles after all, would we? To end this video on a more positive note, I think that there is a silver lining: hardcore server. This has the potential of revitalizing the open world PvP community, while also giving a way to participate to the people who have not been playing the game for the last 5+ years. Borrowing from extraction shooters is something I personally wanted to see from BDO for a while now, so I am really looking forward to this release as well. The game nowadays also has way more ways for you to enjoy PvP than it has ever had, with the notable inclusions of AOS, Guild League and War of the Roses on top of the hardcore server and free Asha servers. Now, these modes are obviously not perfect, nothing ever is, but it still indicates that Pearl Abyss wants you to do PvP content in the game. They just want you to do it in opt-in environments where all parties consent to the fight. There also was the other content announced during Coffin Bolt 2024 in the form of Demon Land, which is probably going to appeal to the hardcore endgame PvPers. Now, I have many, and I do mean many, questions regarding the mode, to the point where I am honestly very skeptical that this will ever see the light of day in the form that it was announced. But I will leave those for another time, perhaps for Heidelberg 2025, if they do end up talking about it in further detail. For now, it is just something for the top 1% of the top 1% to have something to look forward to. And really, that is probably for the best. Separating these two groups once and for all might finally solve the inherent issues that open world PvP has had since time immemorial. And that is it for today, handsome. I admit that this video is probably coming off way more aggressive than I initially wanted it to. But during the research for it, I found nothing but vitriol and hatred from the PvP community towards the direction of the game, as well as some of the player base, which did seem to seep into the script. I already know that people will tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about, or that I should quit the game, or that it's not made for me, which is only going to serve my point and really prove that we should probably not be listening to people who can only see as far as their noses and refuse to help anyone but themselves. To the rest of you who made it to the end of the video, whether you agree with me or not, I hope we can at least have a civil discussion about it, because I do believe that the only way for the game to truly move forward is by accepting that every type of BDO player can and should coexist, whether they do nothing but PvP or everything but PvP. I don't think if a video from a small content creator like me has the power to change the entire community and the way we look at things. But I think that it's better to just try and start building the bridge than to just yell at each other across the valley of death. I don't know how else to end this video, so I think I will just end it there. Remember to like and subscribe, and enjoy your grind.